Welcome to the Centennial College podcast series, PR Shaping the Future. Join our team of post-grad students from the Centennial College Public Relations Corporate Communications program, who have partnered with the Canadian Council of Public Relations Firms to explore diversity and inclusiveness in the PR industry. This will be the first episode of a three-part series where we interview diverse BIPOC individuals who have been making impacts in the world of public relations and communications. My name is Kiara, and today I'm here with special guest Jozef Agtarap, Communications and Outreach Manager of Inspirit Foundations. We will be exploring the works of Inspirit Foundations, Jozef's personal journey in the industry, current barriers and challenges regarding DE&I, and what the future of PR regarding inclusiveness looks like. Let's begin by taking a look at Inspirit Foundations.
So Inspirit Foundation is, again, a foundation. So we work in the business of philanthropy. So our focus is on funding young youth, BIPOC, specifically content creators, to help get their messages out, to help tell their stories with these people who aren't necessarily given the platform to tell these stories. And our two major areas of focus is, the first one is addressing Islamophobia, and the second one is fostering reconciliation. So it was really, really interesting for me, as someone who identifies as BIPOC, to be part of an organization that's willing to support and amplify our voices and kind of give us platforms and funding, which is, again, the racialized communities often don't receive.
Your organization's work sounds incredible in terms of DE&I. Has Inspirit participated in any recent or exceptionally successful initiatives as a result of this?
Working in philanthropy, a lot of the different communications campaigns we have are usually the announcement of support or the announcement of funding for different organizations. One, quite recent campaign that we did was our announcement of funding the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. So the reason I bring up this campaign and the reason I think it was successful is because we, from a communications end, really collaborated with the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund to understand how they best want to provide this message. And again, when you're dealing with, racialized communities, there are some intricacies in the language used, and you want to make sure that, you're honoring and you're respecting all of specific parties. So with that campaign, we set aside a timeline, but we base that timeline on their priorities and however they felt most comfortable in announcing this. For the actual announcement itself, we went with, news wires, press releases, because we are speaking to an audience that we would like to educate, understand that we are supporting, Indigenous peoples, and hopefully they could come in as well. The creation of the language was really a collaborative effort between us and all those involved.
It's amazing that Inspirit was able to support the Indigenous community in such an honorable way, especially considering the intricacies of the language and the culture. How has this campaign aided in starting social change?
The social change that it brought to the communities was really, as a philanthropic organization, showing our support for Indigenous issues and really taking a stance and putting, honestly, our money where our mouth is, with reconciliation being really, really big. Upon all the news of all the unmarked graves that were uncovered, really having our organization publicly putting money forward. And also that kind of causes a ripple effect in the philanthropic community for them to, also take some action. So I think the social change would be collaborating directly with Indigenous communities, but from a bigger standpoint, suggesting action should be taken from different organizations as well.
That's a great point you made, especially about generating a ripple effect to educate and encourage other organizations or even the community around to take action. Let's take a step back and look at your own personal journey in the field. Do you mind explaining a bit about your educational background leading up to communications?
In terms of education, I studied at the University of Toronto, where I did actually a bachelor's of kinesiology, which I know isn't really related to comms, but I eventually did certificates in multimedia journalism, as well as multimedia storytelling and content marketing. So as I mentioned, I kind of had a different career route. I studied initially in the sciences. Coming from a Filipino background, it's very traditional to go into the sciences, to go into healthcare, but by the time I was in fourth year, I realized that my passion and my personality and skill set lend itself to more of a communications role. I really liked writing. I always loved it. It was funny. In high school, that was actually my highest grade. In elementary school, I participated in speech contests, and I always loved public speaking. So there were always signs throughout, my youth or my childhood and even my education where pointing me towards something that had to do with communications. But it was really only until I was in a science degree where like, oh, you know what? Maybe communications is best for me.
Although it wasn't a straight path for you, honing your true skill sets seemed to really lead you to this career. As a BIPOC individual, what are some barriers to entering this field?
Coming, again, from a racialized and immigrant background, a lot of the things that were pushed onto us in school, for example, were really about the sciences or about the maths. There wasn't really targeted campaigns or ways to present other aspects or other fields of work to me as a high school student, or currently to racialized students, right? They currently operate within the spheres of culture that they know, and PR, communications, marketing typically isn't that for those from racialized communities. So I really think one of the bigger barriers to entry is that lack of understanding and lack of awareness of what PR is and what are the different skill sets you need. There are so many racialized storytellers who perhaps haven't had a chance to tell their stories because they didn't know that this was an option for them.
Very true. And it's understandable how BIPOC students, especially those with this cultural cloud over them, tend to either be unaware of or steer away from PR because of this generational familiarity with other career paths. With this being said, is there any advice you have for students who may be considering a career in communications?
So for many, young racialized immigrants or people of color, storytelling is really in our blood, right? From gossiping between aunties to cultural dance and music to coming up with, long-winded stories of excuses we tell our parents when they ask us where we are. Storytelling is really in our blood. And that's a skill that I really encourage youth to develop and take with them on any career path. Oftentimes we don't understand that this is a feasible career path, right? Usually we're told to go into the sciences, we're told to go into the maths, but as born storytellers, there is something there for us to use words and images and visuals to weave a narrative and tell a story, right? So public relations, communications, and marketing is a feasible career for young racialized people to carve something out for themselves in a way that they add to the tapestry that is our own cultural stories. It's really a career I think we can thrive in.
Earlier on in our conversation, one of the proceeds you mentioned for D&I in PR was to develop practices such as messaging and content that are respectful and reflective of the audiences they speak to and the organizations they represent. Are there any internal proceeds you want to suggest?
One thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the notion of power and, where that resides and how does that influence what's the trickle-down effect. So I think in terms of DEI and if you want there to be real change through power is having diversity in those spots of influence and power. There's, often ongoing memes and stuff on LinkedIn where an organization says they're diverse, but then when you look at the triangle of diversity, sure, there are some brown faces at the bottom, but at the top, it's typically all white, right? So I think to disrupt that and have true DEI in organizations is have that representation reflective within all scopes of the power pyramid or the power network, right? It's hard to tout diversity when the top of the organization isn't reflective of that.
Understood. So overall, it builds trust to show that PR and communications is not only an industry that says that they represent and encourage D&I, but that it is an internal practice as well. We have come to the end of our segment, and I want to thank the Communications and Outreach Manager of Inspire Foundations, Jozef Agtarap, for joining us today. Be sure to follow Inspire Foundations on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for updates on the work that they do to achieve a more pluralist and inclusive Canada. Join us next week as we hear another story from another PR practitioner who has also been making impacts in the world of PR and communications, and how we can continue to shape the future of PR. Make sure to subscribe to the Centennial College Podcast, SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. This is Kiara, and this is PR Shaping the Future, presented by Centennial College's Public Relations Corporate Communications Program, partnered with the Canadian Council of Public Relations Firms. Thank you for joining us.